Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into front-end architecture. And you know what? We're going way beyond just like organizing files and folders.
Okay.
It's kind of like you wouldn't start building a skyscraper by deciding what color carpet you want, right?
Yeah.
You'd want to start with the foundation, the blueprints, the architecture.
Right.
And that's what we're doing today.
Yeah.
We're going to be diving deep into this blog post by Thomas Deussen.
And
He's a developer, and he's like all about building things the right way. And he's got some really interesting thoughts on what front-end architecture really is and, more importantly, what it isn't.
Yeah, he gets kind of fired up about this misconception that front-end architecture is just like, where do you put your files? It's like, that's like judging a book by its cover.
Yeah.
It's the structure is a result of decisions, not the other way around.
Okay, so if it's not just about folders and files, then like what are those deeper architectural decisions?
So like, imagine you're actually building a skyscraper.
Yeah.
Right? An architectural decision would be like choosing to use steel versus concrete for the frame of that building.
Okay.
That decision has huge consequences for like the building's strength, how high you can build it, even how fast you can actually build it.
That makes sense.
Similarly, in front end, an architectural decision might be opting for like a micro front end approach versus, a more monolithic one.
So instead of having one giant application, you break it down into smaller independent applications that then like talk to each other.
Exactly, yeah. And just like with the steel versus concrete, that decision has a ripple effect. It impacts how teams can collaborate, how easily you can scale the application, even what technologies you can use.
That's huge. So it's not just about what's happening right now, but how those decisions are going to affect the project like way down the line.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about those big picture decisions that have a huge impact on the project as a whole.
So then how do we know what material to use, so to speak? Like how do we decide when to go for those micro front ends or any other, architectural pattern?
That's where Deusson's concept of architectural drivers comes in. These are the factors, both technical and business related, that heavily influence your architectural decisions.
So like how fast does the application need to load? How many users is it going to have to handle at once?
Exactly. If you're building like a real-time stock trading platform,
Oh, yeah.
speed and responsiveness are absolutely critical. That might steer you towards certain technologies or architectural patterns that prioritize performance, even if they make the project more complex overall.
So it's like saying, we need this building to withstand earthquakes, even if it means like adding extra support beams and making the whole construction process more complex.
Just nicely. It's all about trade-offs. Every architectural decision, you're going to have benefits, but often at a cost. You might gain speed, but you might lose a little bit of ease of maintenance. Or you might choose scalability over having a really fast initial development time.
It sounds like there are a lot of things to like juggle when you're making these decisions. So apart from like performance and scalability, what other architectural drivers should we be keeping in mind?
Well, think about security. If you're dealing with like sensitive user data, that's going to be a major driver in your decisions.
Right. You can't just slap a security patch on at the end and call it a day.
Exactly. And then there's maintainability, especially if you have like a big team working on a project.
Yeah, because a million lines of spaghetti code might like technically work, but nobody wants to be the one who has to go back and try to untangle that mess later.
You got it. And let's not forget about just like practical things. Budget and time constraints,
Right.
those are real-world limitations
Yeah.
that can really impact what you choose to do.
It's like deciding whether to add that rooftop garden to our skyscraper. It sounds amazing in theory, but can we actually afford it? And do we have time to do it before the deadline?
Deussen really hammers home this point about limitations.
Yeah.
It's about being realistic.
Yeah.
You can't just pick the shiniest, coolest architecture and assume it's going to work perfectly in every situation.
So how do we find that sweet spot? Like the balance between the ideal architecture versus the one that we can actually achieve given all these constraints we have.
It all comes back to asking the right questions. And Deussen actually provides like a whole bunch of really insightful questions in his blog post that are like gold for anyone building a front end.
Give me some examples. What kind of questions should we be asking?
So one that really stood out to me was, how often are deployments expected?
Okay.
If you're in like a fast-paced environment where you're pushing updates multiple times a day,
Right.
your architecture needs to be able to support that.
Yeah, it's like having a revolving door for our skyscraper. You don't want people stuck waiting every time somebody tries to go in or out.
Exactly. Another good one. He says, what are the consequences of changing a shared component? This gets at the heart of dependencies. how tightly coupled different parts of your application should be.
So if one team changes their code, we don't want the whole skyscraper leaning to one side because they accidentally knocked out a load-bearing beam.
That's a great way to put it. It's about understanding those ripple effects, you know, and designing your architecture to minimize risk and maximize flexibility.
This is all starting to make a lot more sense, but there's one thing I hear debated all the time. Can choosing a specific tool or library be considered like an architectural decision in and of itself? What's Dewson's take on that?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting. He argues that while the tools are obviously important, they're not inherently architectural decisions on their own. It's more about the underlying approach that that tool represents.
Okay, I need an example.
Okay, so take Redux, for instance. It's a popular state management library, but just because you happen to be using Redux doesn't automatically mean you have a good architecture.
So it's not about Redux itself, but like what it represents in terms of your overall approach.
It's exactly. Choosing Redux or any other state management solution is about making a conscious decision about how you are going to manage state in your application.
Okay.
Are you centralizing everything, like what you would do with Redux? Or are you going with a more distributed approach?
Right.
That decision has major implications for how your application behaves, how well it scales, how easy it is to maintain.
So it's like deciding whether we're going to have a central air conditioning system for our skyscraper
Yeah.
or if we're going to install individual units in each room. Both approaches can work, but they both have like trade-offs.
You got it. Redux might be the perfect solution for certain projects,
Right.
especially larger ones with very complex data flows. But it can also add complexity, and it could potentially even hinder modularity down the line, especially if you think you might want to move to micro frontends in the future.
So just like with all of these architectural decisions, there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to things like state management.
Exactly. You have to weigh the pros and cons based on your specific drivers.
Your limitation?
Yep. And the overall goals of the project.
It's like choosing the right type of elevator for our skyscraper. We wouldn't want to install a tiny single-person lift if we're expecting thousands of visitors every single day, right?
That's a great analogy. The key takeaway here is to understand the why behind the tools and patterns you choose. Don't just blindly follow the latest trends. Think critically about whether a particular approach actually aligns with your project's needs and your overall architectural vision.
So before we wrap up, what are some key takeaways that listeners should keep in mind when they're actually making these architectural decisions?
Think of it this way. Front-end architecture is kind of like laying the foundation for a whole city.
Okay.
You don't just start plopping down buildings all over the place without any plan, right?
Right. You need to think about the streets and how they connect and
Exactly.
and like where the bridges are going to go and
You got to think about traffic flow,
yeah,
access to resources,
right.
future growth.
So instead of just randomly adding streets and bridges, we need to step back and think about how everything connects.
Yeah. And how those decisions we make now are going to affect things in the future.
Exactly. It's not just about building something that works right now. It's got to be able to grow and change as like our needs evolve.
Exactly. It's about anticipating challenges, understanding those trade-offs,
Yeah.
and designing a system that can adapt over time. And don't forget about those architectural drivers we talked about earlier.
Right, right.
You got to keep those front and center throughout this whole process.
Because it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, right?
Yeah, but make sure all your choices are still aligned with your performance goals.
Your scalability needs.
Yep, any security considerations.
Right, because those are going to be different for every single project.
Yeah.
You know, a simple blog isn't going to have the same architectural needs as some giant web application that's handling millions of users.
Absolutely. One last thing, and this is something Dewson mentions a few times in his post.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate the importance of communication.
Yeah.
Regularly talk to your team about the architectural decisions you're making.
Makes sense.
Explain why you're doing things a certain way.
Be open to feedback.
Yeah,
Because even the best laid plans can go totally sideways if everybody's not on the same page.
precisely.
Yeah.
Architecture isn't a solo sport. It's a team effort.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's about working together to build that shared understanding of the system and how everything fits together.
So to wrap things up, what's the one big takeaway you want listeners to like walk away with today?
When it comes to front-end architecture, it's all about making strategic decisions. Decisions that align with your project's goals,
Yeah.
your constraints,
Your limitations.
your long-term vision.
So think critically, ask the right questions.
And don't be afraid to evolve your approach as you learn more.
This has been a great deep dive. We went from folders and files to like skyscrapers and cities.
I know, right?
Thanks for joining us today, and happy building, everyone.